Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show on this Tuesday, December 16th, 2014. I'm David Knight, your host today. I'm going to be joined in the next segment by Marin Katusa, who wrote The Colder War. This is a very fascinating book because for me, a lot of these events, I was aware of them, I remembered them, I didn't have them in a timeline, in a context. And I want to read to you because I found this to be absolutely amazing. The false flag techniques that Vladimir Putin used to hoist himself to the top. This is something that parallels exactly what has happened with our government so many times in the last decade. Now, there were they had a previous war with Chechnya that basically left the Soviet Union embarrassed and looking ineffective. He used a second Chechen war to make himself look very strong and powerful as a leader. It was a short war, even though the conflict stretched on for a long time. They declared victory very early, kind of like Bush with his mission accomplished. But I want to read to you what led up to this. Now, this is from the book, The Colder War. They said the first of four closely spaced terrorist attacks came September 4th, 1999 in Dagestan. Now, that would be in Chechnya. There was a bomb that leveled a barracks that was housing Russian soldiers and their families. 64 Russian men, women, and children were killed. 5 days later, there was a bombing in Moscow, this time an apartment building. The working-class neighborhood in the city's southeast had a device that had been stashed on the building's ground floor, brought down all 8 floors, and killed 94 residents as they slept. Now, here's the key. Within hours, the Russian government officials all but certified that Chechen terrorists were responsible, and calls for retaliation came from all political quarters. Instead of treating the site as an active crime scene, however, and sifting through the ruins, what did the Russian authorities do? They razed the building just days after the blast and hauled the rubble away to a municipal dump. Where have you seen that happen before? To an FSB storehouse. Not the FBI's storehouse like we do here, but this is the FSB. Nothing was left for examination by third parties. Then 4 days later, authorities were called early in the morning to check on suspicious activity outside another apartment building on Moscow's outskirts. They left about 2 a.m., not finding anything. They didn't notice a massive bomb in the building, which exploded 3 hours later at 5 a.m. in the morning. A 9-story building collapsed, 121 died. Then came something very odd. A speaker of the Duma, Russia's lower parliamentary house, relayed to the parliament a report that he just received that an apartment building 700 miles south of Moscow had been blown up the previous night. Not in Moscow, but in a different location. Okay, so what happens is that didn't happen yet. That happened later. Shades of the BBC announcing that Building 7 had collapsed. Now, it said that it seemed no more than an inconsequential blunder until 3 days later, an apartment building in the city that he had named was indeed blown up. And so a Duma member asked, "How did it happen that you told us on Monday about a blast that didn't occur until Thursday?" In lieu of an answer, the questioner had his microphone cut off. Then it gets even more interesting. Then something very strange happened in Ryazan, 120 miles southeast of Moscow. They say everybody was on hyper alert, looking for something to happen to an apartment building. So some residents noted that a white car pulled up and 2 guys get out, go into the basement, and leave large sacks. They call the police, who then discovered 3 110-pound sacks wired to a detonator and a timer in the basement. They quickly evacuated the building. A local explosive expert was called in to disarm the device. He determined that they contained an explosive, RDX, powerful enough to bring down the entire building, as we've seen before. In the meantime, they blocked all the roads leading out of this town. Acting Prime Minister Putin flexed his rhetorical muscles, he says, and congratulated the residents for their vigilance. The Russian Interior Minister chimed in, lauded recent improvements, and then they found out they actually arrested the guys, and they were with the FSB. They were their CIA. Then they changed the story. They said, "We were just testing your vigilance." Do you see how this happens? It's called a false flag. It's used over and over again by every government. We're going to talk to the author of that, Marin Katusa, right after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, your host today. And we're going to be talking to Marin Katusa, the author of The Colder War. If you don't hear the previous segment based on your radio station, if they're carrying the news in the previous segment, I would suggest that you look at the online version of what I covered. It was a very interesting chronology of the way that Putin used false flags to essentially ascend to power. A lot of parallels to what goes on in this country, or maybe even better yet, buy the book. This book is a page turner. I really enjoyed it. It puts a lot of events that I remember vaguely. It brings them back, freshens them up, puts them in a timeline, and more importantly, puts them in a much larger context. Let's go to, is Marin on the line now? Okay, let's go to Marin Katusa, the author of The Colder War. He works for Casey Research. He is a economics advisor. He has a newsletter there, as well as you manage a hedge fund, don't you, as well?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah, it's one of the largest in Western Canada.
Yes. And I tell you what, you certainly know the context, and we've seen massive moves in the last couple of weeks. We've seen the U.S. Congress move to cover derivatives for the banks, something that has massive implications for U.S. taxpayers. But we also see this massive move by Saudi Arabia to not cut production in the face of falling energy prices, essentially creating a lot of problems for Russia already. We see that the ruble has fallen 20%. They have raised their interest rates to 17%. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, you're nailing all these right on the head, and congratulations to you, because your viewers are getting information that they're not getting in the mainstream media. What a lot of people, if you want a breaking story, what my sources in Russia are now telling me, that actually Lavrov, who's the equivalent of the Secretary of Foreign Affairs for the Russians, has basically stated and warned that the Russians, because now they view Crimea as part of Russia, they're going to be moving nuclear weapons there. And according to the Russian strategy, if you want to talk about false flags, here's the ultimate false flag, where now the Russians are going to be moving nuclear weapons into Crimea, which is a huge risk for the Western authorities. Now, in the last 24 hours, Germany has now also done a 180 on the U.S. sanctions and saying, wait, let's time out here. Germany does not want Russia and Turkey to solidify a long-term contract deal, because the last thing Germany wants is to be vulnerable, and for the European Union to be vulnerable on Turkey's holding the tap. So now Turkey is holding off on advancing the sanctions. So we're in real time. Things are changing, and the Russians have many more false flags to keep the turmoil going. Yes, the oil price has gone down for Russia, but what's important to understand is the ruble price has decreased much more than the price of the oil. So if you're a Russian oil producer, that's the best of both, the best that you can possibly be in the situation, because you're still in a bull market or an uptrend in your oil. So these are very important facts to understand that our Western media is not talking about.
One of the things that I'm concerned about is putting the American taxpayer on the hook for ensuring through the FDIC program the derivatives market, because there's already been reports that a lot of oil futures are going to be essentially worthless. Already that's happening. As the future market starts to tumble, that's going to spread out, as we've seen in the past, to other commodities, as well as we're already seeing to the currency in Russia. And of course, that's going to continue to spread to the larger stock market. Looks very unstable.
It is the biggest risk right now to the North American markets that nobody's talking about. In our at the end of the chapter in our book, The Colder War, we get into exactly that, why to understand that derivatives is so important. And this really is nuclear economic weapons of mass destruction. That who's regulating this? Which banks are going to be vulnerable? And Americans need to understand, is your personal savings at risk here? And I'm telling you, the implosion of the debt and the derivatives markets on the U.S. shale, everyone's thinking that it's the Russians that are suffering. The U.S. shale sector is significantly suffering at $55 oil. So there's a lot of risks out there.
Oh, absolutely. And to me, it looks like a massive economic war, of course, has already broken out with what's going on with the oil. That's Putin's base. He's built his country, as you pointed out. His master plan is to base the country on natural resources. So when they attack that, meanwhile, Putin is attacking the petrodollar, which has essentially been the big leverage that America has had in terms of being the world's economy. Let's go back and talk. Let's kind of run this out. Talk about how this is not something that started with the Cold War. This is what you point out is called the Great Game, going back to Rudyard Kipling. This is something that's been going on with Russia and the West for a long time. Talk about that a little bit.
Definitely. So let's bring it back to when, it was the Western world that discovered oil in the Middle East. And if you go to Iran and understand the history, we go through all that in the Colder War. But essentially, the British, that's where they secured all their oil for World War II, was through Iran. And then the Americans came in the 50s and they overthrew the existing regime, and then it backfired on them. So then they moved over to Saudi Arabia. Now, when the oil crisis in the early 70s happened, America was faced with a double attack. First of all, oil prices quadrupled essentially in a few months. And the second one was when the French basically called the US dollar and wanted their gold back. Nixon had no choice but to close the gold window. So now Kissinger had to come up with a plan. And what he devised was he went to Saudi Arabia and said, look, this is what we need to do. We can guarantee your family, the House Assad, a long-lasting regime, but this is what you need to do. You can only sell your oil in terms of US dollars, and then you have to reinvest those currency, those reserves back into the US dollar. And with Saudi Arabia as the most powerful producer of the OPEC nations, then you had Kuwait follow, Qatar, UAE, and other OPEC nations. So that's the beginning of the petrodollar, and that has been very important to the average way of life of the average American that a lot of people don't realize is now at risk.
So what they did essentially was they offered a protection racket, just as governments and gangsters typically do. They say, we're going to protect you in exchange for our protection, our military weapons, and we're going to make sure that your country, I guess we could call it a company, that your country remains secure and that the House of Saud essentially stays in control here. We're going to do everything we can with the CIA, with the military-industrial complex to protect you. In return, we're going to make sure that you price oil in dollars, and then you take all the money that you get and you bank it at the Federal Reserve. So there we've got the CIA as well as the Federal Reserve, our two organizations that we're not allowed to audit, both there in supporting the House of Saud. And, of course, Prince Bandar, 22 years as an ambassador to the United States, now head of the Saudi intelligence service, pushing very heavily for us to get involved in a war in Syria, promising that Saudi Arabia would even pay our expenses if we would go to war with in Syria. This is essentially somebody that is tied in as a proxy for the CIA, a proxy for the Federal Reserve in this area, isn't it?
You've nailed it. That's exactly what it is. And, Saudi Arabia really is a family corporation. When I traveled to Kuwait and went to Iraq, it really is a small, rich class. And then it's all the workers, and there's workers from, India, Thailand, across the world, and they have no voting rights, even though they try to say, that everyone's equal. It really isn't. And it's really a shame that the Americans are exposed, that that's who your allies are. It really is a suppressed society. And you look at what's going on here, even with Syria, where Obama has failed foreign policy. He was backing the exact individuals which today are ISIS. This is really, if you wanted to write a book about failed foreign policy, all you have to do is just write a summary of what Obama's done in the last 6 years. And it's sadly what every American needs to know. The worst possible outcome of a failed U.S. foreign policy is Obama's pushed Russia and China closer together than the last 100 years combined. And that is the worst possible aspect, and that's part of what we're calling the Colder War.
News article today that just came out. China's treasury holdings fall to their lowest since February 2013. They held $1.25 trillion in U.S. debt, but as of October, a $13.6 billion drop from September, said the Treasury Department. So already we see the Federal Reserve losing some of its clout there. That is a key part of the petrodollar, that the Federal Reserve keeps that clout there. And, of course, the way that Putin is going to attack the petrodollar is using BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. He's going to use them to go around the American dollar and essentially take the American dollar away from being the world's reserve currency. Is that correct?
Definitely. And I urge all your viewers to go to the Colder War website, colderwar.com. We've actually created videos to really make it an entertaining, but more importantly, educational aspect of what's going on right now with the Colder War. And, my book made the New York Times bestseller list, and we really nail what's going on. It's not just about, China and Russia, but you look at France. They've attacked the petrodollar. They've turned their back on the US dollar. You look at what Canada's doing, one of the major partners and the little brother of America, they're now doing currency swaps outside of the US dollar. You know, this secret of the petrodollar, the rest of the world's talking about, it's only the American government that's trying to hide it and cover it up.
Yeah, I like your book because, like I said before, it puts things into a context, and it's a real page turner. I didn't expect to see that from an economics book. Anybody that likes history, anybody that likes politics is really going to like this book. I like the fact that you go back and to very old history and bring it up to the current level in so many different countries and in so many different ways. And as you pointed out, of course, as everybody knows, after World War II, the U.S. was essentially in the catbird seat. They were untouched domestically in terms of production. They had most of the world's manufacturing capacity, a large part of the world's gold. And as you pointed out, as that commodity started to come under pressure, they moved over to essentially using oil as the economy, as the commodity that's backing the currency. I had never really thought about it that way before.
The American electricity matrix is dependent about 10%. 1 in every 10 homes in America is powered by Russian nuclear fuel.
Well, hang on. We're going to be right back. We've got to go to commercial break with Marin Katusa, The Colder War. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show on this Tuesday, December 16th, 2014. I'm David Knight, and we're talking to Marin Katusa. As his bio here points out, he's one of the most successful fund managers in the energy and resource exploration sectors. His hands-on approach has taken him around the world, and he really understands the historical context. This is an excellent book here, The Colder War, published by Casey Publishing. And, of course, that's Doug Casey's group, and Doug Casey has been a guest with here with Alex several times. Now, just before we went to the break, Mr. Katusa, you started to talk about the U.S. dependence on Russian oil. Tell us about that.
Well, it's actually the Russian nuclear fuel, uranium.
Yes, sorry.
And
yeah.
It's shocking to me that, last year, for example, a Russian company produced more uranium on American soil than all of the American companies combined. That's shocking to me. America imports 90% of the uranium it consumes, and America is the largest consumer of uranium in the world. And more importantly, 10%, one out of every 10 homes in America is powered by Russian nuclear fuel. This is shocking. These are risks that people aren't talking about right now that Americans need to know. It needs to be brought up to the politicians so we can change this failed foreign policy.
And of course, our energy, our access to cheap energy affects not only our lifestyle, but even our health, our longevity in any country. You can go back and you can show that access to cheap energy is the biggest producer of wealth in any country. Putin understands that. He has built his global plan, as you point out in the book, on the rich natural resources of Russia in terms of being very rich in oil and natural gas, in terms of uranium. On the other hand, we have a president who, even before he came into office, said he was going to shut down the coal industry. He said you could build it, but you could build a coal plant, but it's going to bankrupt you. It looks to me like what he's trying to do is bankrupt the country, either by design or by incompetence. The collateral damage of what Saudi Arabia is doing with the oil prices, they may be aiming that at Putin, or they may be aiming it at domestic competition from oil shale. But either way, it is very destructive of our country's wealth, and it's something that our closest ally, Saudi Arabia, that we supposedly are protecting, is doing against us, not just against the Russians.
You've nailed it. I'm really enjoying the show because as a host, as an interviewer, you're really hitting all of the key subjects here. And I do hundreds of these interviews a year, and it's very rare that someone actually understands this to the depth you do. And what's really critical here is exactly as you stated, I see OPEC with Russia and the U.S. production in a three-way war. It's about market share. And what's critical to the petrodollar, U.S. went from the largest customer to OPEC and Saudi Arabia to now a major competitor to Saudi Arabia and Qatar and UAE, where NGLs, natural gas liquids, and condensates are now competing for Qatar and Saudi market share. At the same time, the Russians are also competing with it. And ironically, what's going to happen is the side effect, U.S. shale production cannot compete with Russian production or Saudi or the OPEC Gulf, the Arab states production. So you're going to see an implosion within the U.S. corporate oil producers because of the debt level. And it's going to hurt because where have all the big high-paying jobs? in Obama's administration happened. It didn't happen in his green bubble revolution, which has completely popped and failed. It's happened in the Bakken, where it's the lowest employment rates in America. It's happened in the Eagleford. It's the American energy revolution that has caused these high-paying jobs, and these high-paying jobs are at risk.
And of course, Marin, I just read yesterday on the news here, there was an article from the Telegraph in the UK talking about, well, this falling oil price is going to be good for us in the short term as consumers at the gas pump, but, you know, we're going to have to keep level or maybe even increase rates to consumers for heating their homes because we're going to have to subsidize our renewable resources. So they're not even going to pass along a temporary savings because we know this is temporary. Once Saudi Arabia or OPEC reestablishes their hegemony in energy prices, you're going to see it skyrocket again. That's always the game for the big guys to take a loss. They can hold on and take a loss for a while until they drive out their upcoming competitors. And then once they do, Katie bar the door. They're going to hit us really hard.
Exactly. And Germany's even in a worse situation than the UK. Look at Germany. A lot of people don't realize that in the last decade, they've actually increased their oil imports from the former USSR by over 52%. You look at their gas imports. Germany needs the Russian oil and gas to keep its economy going, and Germany's the economic engine of Europe. So Europe is so vulnerable here.
Well, you know, one of the things that we'll talk about, we're running out of time for this segment. We've got to go to a break, and we're going to come back and talk about Putin, because one of the things I liked about your book is it isn't a hagiography, and it isn't a cartoon demon characterization of Putin. You show how he's dangerous, how he's competitive, how his interests do not ally but compete with ours in many ways. I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about the petrodollar. You've got a chapter on post-petrodollar. We'll talk about that after we come back with Marin Katusa. The book is The Colder War. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, your host today. I have Marin Katusa on the line, and we're talking about his book, The Colder War. A fascinating book that really gives you a background as to what's happening with this developing Cold War that is right now in a full-on economic war. We're going to talk about the rise of Putin as well as the coming fall of the petrodollar in just a moment. But before we go back to Marin, I want to let you know that we got a 2-day-only special. We have an essential holiday health pack. It has Secret 12, X2, Nascent Iodine, and Silver Bullet, all three, for only $59.99. That's a retail value of $139.85. You save $79.90, nearly 57%. It's a limited time offer. It's only today and tomorrow. If you order today or tomorrow, you can get your products delivered by Christmas guaranteed. So that's a essential holiday pack, a 2-day special only. That's Secret 12, X2, Nascent Iodine, and Silver Bullet, all three for only $59.99. Now, before the break, Marin, we were talking about I said I wanted to cover Putin's rise as well as the petrodollar. But before we get to that, I wanted to get your comments as a fund manager about what's going on. I just saw a notice that COMEX is going to implement gold and silver price limit collars. Effective on the 21st, they're going to limit price fluctuations will kick in at $100 moves in gold and $3 moves in silver. What are they concerned about? Looks like the Russian currency is crumbling. We've got derivatives and oil that are coming in. It looks like a very unstable time, doesn't it?
It really is. And as an investor, whether you're a fund manager, or even at a retail level, for all the mom and pops out there, what you have to understand is it's not true capitalism, as Bud Conrad, an economist at Casey Research, says. It's about interventions and understanding what's going on. So if you look at Obama's administration, I would sum it up as he has increased the debt of the American government by over 50% under his watch, and he's made the worst decisions. So I call it financial heroin. He's made the system addicted to financial heroin. And the worst thing for your viewers to understand, to have, is going into the next evolution and sector of this colder war is to be exposed to the debt, because look what the Russians are going through right now. If your interest rates go up and you're exposed to margin calls or increased volatility, be very careful. And that's why the derivatives, when you mentioned them earlier, are so critical, because as the petrodollar does collapse, and it will, then you get the derivatives kick in, and who's going to control this? We're talking about, quadrillions of dollars, numbers that people can't even fathom. We're in uncharted territory here. And
we're already seeing oil derivatives coming under a lot of pressure. Many of them are already worthless. People are scrambling to cover that. I mean, it's just the coming tidal wave of economic problems to me is just it's very apparent. All these forces that are building up at the end of the year right now, very, very worrying. Let's talk for a moment about Vladimir Putin before we talk about the consequences. You got a chapter in your book called Post Petrodollar. I want to talk about the consequences of what happens when we lose the petrodollar here in America. But let's talk about Putin. Talk about his rise to power. What makes this guy tick?
Well, it's not money. When you look at a lot of politicians, he's the exact opposite of Obama. What Putin truly believes is his mission on earth is to bring Russia back to its previous greatness under Peter the Great. A good ideology of him is when he came into power, he was the head of the basically what we call the old KGB. This guy is a Soviet trained, he's brilliant, but he's driven by national pride. And he hung up a photo.
Let me give an anecdote from your book. You pointed out that his grandfather, who essentially mentored him, was somebody who was a cook for Lenin and then Stalin. He managed to survive the purges, and there were even rumors that he was with the NKVD. This is a guy that had a lot of influence on him, and at an early age, Putin went to the KGB and wanted to know what he could do. And you report in his book that they told him, well, the best thing you could do if you want to get in the KGB is get a law degree. And they came looking for him when he went to law school and recruited him at the age of 22. This is a guy who he was caught up in the James Bond type of espionage stuff. They had their own version of it in Russia. He was caught up in that. He got very interested in martial arts, wanted to be a KGB person. He's got a much different, longer-term point of view than Obama, doesn't he?
Oh, definitely. And he's working with the Chinese who plan in 20, 30-year cycles. Obama plans according to his Twitter account, which is by seconds. So, you can't compare the two. But more importantly, what this is all doing, and the real threat here in the Colder War, is the emerging markets are now working closer together than ever before. And the Western markets, the old allies of the U.S. are trying to sit here going, well, we can't do what the Americans want anymore. For example, Germany was really being pushed by the American sanctions onto Russia, but now Germany's painted in a corner. So really, Obama has isolated his allies and, more importantly, has pushed his enemies closer together.
You point out that as we enact these trade sanctions, we're essentially throwing fire on the de-dollarization in terms of removing the dollar as reserve currency. Explain that.
Well, sanctions are just another form of war. Come going to lose in a sanction. And, it's sad that it's got to go that way because there's so many better alternatives. But the sanctions are going to come back, and they've already backfired on the German economy. It's starting to backfire on other European economies. And remember, winter's coming, and Eastern Europe and Western Europe depends about a third of its natural gas on Russia. Russia's not down and out. Never underestimate the Russians. They have survived things that most people can't even fathom. And Obama is underestimating. Remember when in the debate with Romney, when Romney said Russia is our greatest threat, and Obama laughed and said, what are you talking about? The Cold War ended 20 years ago. Obama's completely clueless to what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so is the American public, too. They don't remember, as you point out in your book, you said at one time Ukraine was Russia. At the beginning of the interview, you pointed out that it looks like Putin is going to move nuclear weapons into Crimea. They're not about to let Crimea go, are they?
No, definitely. There's four key critical elements that is about Crimea. First of all, over 90% of the people are Russian and Russian speaking. So if you understand Putin's strategy, what I call the Slavic warrior mentality, he's not going to let any Russian be suppressed or be threatened. More importantly, it's about the gas pipeline. Second, the offshore oil and gas deposits. It's a deep sea warm port, which is very important for Russia's military. And fourth, the key critical part that no media is talking about is if Crimea stayed in even Ukraine or Eastern Ukraine, Ukraine could now import U.S. and European goods and trade them to the former USSR states at a tax advantage that the Russians couldn't. So it's also a threat to the U.S. manufacturing strategy, and Putin won't have any of it. And they will defend Crimea as they will defend Moscow.
You point out in your book, you go back to the Rose Revolution in Georgia, talking about how at that time South Ossetia and another territory tried to secede from Georgia. And of course, at that point in time, we were against self-rule and self-government, just as we've seen with the Ukraine situation. We are for Ukraine seceding from the Soviet, from Russia, and then we oppose Crimea seceding from the Ukraine. I mean, there's absolutely cannot make a coherent argument for this. It's just naked power politics that they're playing here with the energy that's going on here. It's like, draw some parallels between the Rose Revolution and what we have just seen in the Ukraine with the Maiden Revolution.
Sure. So the Rose was first, and it was really funded by the NGOs, American money, Western money coming in. And it was the beginning. But at the time, Putin didn't yet solidify. He didn't take on the oligarchs yet at the time. He didn't control the domestic Russian oil and gas and resources. So he kind of stayed put and let things develop. Then we had the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and that was big. That was very important. That really showed a shift. And now the Maiden Revolution is really the EU versus Russia, and the EU is backed by America. And it's really the American incentive to fight the Russian foreign politics here. And it's a retaliation that most people in the West did not expect because they thought Putin would back down. That is not the situation. And if you want to compare it to, let's say, the former Yugoslav Republic of Kosovo, where America defended Kosovo is exactly what Russia is now doing for their side. So, we've been seeing flip-flop politics, and there's a lot of flags of awareness and failed foreign policy on the Western sides. And remember, Putin's going to do exactly what's best for Russia's long-term strategy. If it means going to economic war or physical war or supplying weapons or moving the nuclear weapons into Crimea, Putin won't think twice about it.
Absolutely. He's got a long-term plan. And part of that long-term plan includes moving into the Arctic, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. That's where the world-class deposits are. And it's ironic that even though there were sanctions against Russia from the U.S., Exxon, America's largest oil producer, was still moving forward and doing the offshore development. And they didn't pull out. They got an exception to complete that well because according to the terms of the contract, if Exxon backed out, they would lose billions of barrels of oil. So it's in Exxon's best interest to work with Russia. Exxon wants to work with Russia, and it's all about the future world-class deposits. And, Exxon and other major American oil companies have realized that the political instability in the Middle East, where other world-class oil deposits, not worth the risk. So there's not many places around the world that you can get billions of barrels of deposits. And Russia's definitely one of the most important countries for oil, natural gas, and uranium.
You point out in your book that in the Arctic, there's estimated to be 200 billion barrels, over 10% of the world's total. And you also point out that there's a lot of different competing claims. Canada's got claims there, U.S., Norway, even Denmark. Just this last couple of days, Denmark made a claim that they own the North Pole. I guess we should let Santa Claus know.
Exactly. And, who would you want to back on that? Russia with Putin or Canada? Harper? Come on.
Yeah, I think if push comes to shove, and it probably will, I think Russia's going to go there. But you make another point here that I wasn't aware of. So after 13 years of wrangling, the UN's Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf awarded Russia jurisdiction over a 20,000 square mile area in the Sea of Okhotsk, I guess is how, I don't know how you pronounce that. But basically, they've already had the UN side with their territorial claims.
Oh, definitely. And more importantly, what no one's realizing is Russia is the world's largest country from just a landmass, and they haven't even started their unconventional oil and gas development. They're just going for the easy conventional stuff. So Russia is so powerful, and the emerging markets have realized that with Russia, it's about business. There's no political agenda. There's no moral, religious agenda. The Russians want to do business with China, and that's the deal, and now they're pushed together. Dealing with the Americans, look, Germany's realized the spying events that's happened under Obama's administration. The Chinese have realized it. And, unfortunately, all of this has come to fruition, and the failed foreign policy has proven to be worse than we all expected it would be. So America, unfortunately, has painted itself in a corner, and really it's going to need another leader like a Reagan type, someone to get Americans behind their leader to take on the emerging markets, which have very strong leadership led by Putin.
I think it's going to require somebody who is going to repudiate our surveillance state, the idea that we have a hegemonic claim on everybody's information. I think that has left a stench on the American government that is not going to be erased until we do something very visible, very tangible to pull that back out. I want to talk about another area, and that, of course, is Africa. And we saw the Bilderberg Group a couple of years ago talking about how their big pushes were going to be big data. That was before we saw the Ed Snowden leaks, and also Africa. We see AFRICOM being created as recently as 2007. So the U.S. is definitely interested in the natural resources of Africa. But of course, Putin, who bases all of his plans on natural resources, is very interested in Africa. Talk about that.
Oh, definitely. And it's with the Chinese. The Russian and Chinese are working together, and they are literally 2 decades ahead of America when it comes to the infrastructure, the deposits. The largest onshore oil discovery in the world in the last decades was a company Doug Casey and I were involved with, and they proved up, billions of barrels of oil on eastern Africa and Kenya. It's called the East African Rift. And ironically, when you go there, it literally looked like a pic out of a James Bond movie where they're all wearing their orange overalls and they're happy to work, and they're all Asians. You don't see North American companies working there. It's all Russian and Chinese drillers, Russian and Chinese geophysics. China's been there. They're going to write the infrastructure checks. They're moving forward for the development because it's about a secure supply. And the Russians and Chinese are planning for 20, 30, 40 years out to keep their economies going.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, we had Obama go and make his agreement with China that we were going to, over 11 years, cut our energy use by 25%, but China is going to be allowed to continue to expand for 16 years unabated, at which point they won't have a cut, but they'll have a cap. It's okay for them under, I guess we're not concerned about global warming. It's only a concern when it is something that is generated by the U.S. or Western governments.
It's ironic. You bring up a brilliant point here that reminded me. During the APEC conference, Obama made a big deal about the CO2 contracts and, the limitations. And in our Western media, they really try to portray Obama as a true foreign icon with his presidency. If you read the Chinese papers, it was almost a mockery where the Xi Jinping, the president of China, came out and said, "Look, Obama, calm down, Tiger. You fill a sea by drops at a time. We're still in drops here. Take your time. Let's not make a big deal out of this contract." But from the Western media, it was the APEC conference was all about this, agreement where the Chinese kind of completely thought nothing of it.
I guess that's one of the things that really strikes me about your book, Marin, and that is the fact that Putin is very methodical, taking a long view, not only just for himself, but also for his country. He's actually doing things to help Russia. It's not in America's best interest, the things that he's doing, but he's actually working to help his country, whereas we have leaders who look to be actively undermining, actively trying to bankrupt our country, whether it's with open borders and a Cloward and Piven strategy, or whether it's taking down our energy production or taxing away our energy use. It seems like our own government is our worst enemy. But let's talk about one of your final chapters. I think it is your final chapter here, Post-Petrodollar America. You point out that the decline of the British pound took 30 years and 2 world wars, and to unwind the empire took longer. Is that going to happen with the United States? Or maybe, as you think, there's going to be factors that argue that the undoing of the dollar will be very abrupt and very disturbing. Tell us how you think that's going to play out and why you think that's going to be abrupt and massive.
It's going to be very disturbing for those who are not prepared and protected. You need insurance, whether you have health insurance or car insurance. You never plan on using it, but when you need it, that's when you want it. And it's all about preparing and basically preventing being exposed to the derivative defaults, the collapse of the petrodollar. And it's actually quite simple to do so. Number one, live within your means and stay out of massive debt and don't leverage yourself. Number two, have a little bit of gold exposure, physical gold, because that is an insurance hedge to a depreciating dollar. Now, everyone in Wall Street is talking about how great the US dollar is. That's exactly when you need insurance, when you're driving 200 kilometers or 150 miles per hour with your top down thinking about great of a day. You need to have that insurance. So that's the first place to start. And then we get into different aspects. But, when the petrodollar collapses, and it will, and every empire collapses, literally the average way of life for the American is going to be cut in half overnight. And everyone's going to sit there and going, what happened? Except those who are prepared for it.
And as you point out, we have the world's largest military. We've taken a hit in most other aspects of our productivity. We've had our manufacturing base decimated, yet we have a massive military. And of course, when people see their lifestyle cut in half, as you just mentioned, they're going to look for an enemy outside of the country. And that's when things are going to get hot. Stay with us. We're going to one more segment with Marin, and he'll be right back with his book, The Colder War. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and we're talking to Marin Katusa of KC Research and his book, The Colder War. I would highly recommend this book. It's a very interesting read. Any student of history or politics, anybody who wants to get an understanding of what I think are things that are on the horizon. We've seen a lot of very ominous signs. We've seen Russia's central bank hiking key interest rates in just the last day or so to 17%. That's their interest rate. They've seen their currency tumble by 20%. We see Goldman Sachs, this is a headline up on Infowars.com, Goldman Sachs says oil prices can go lower for much longer, and that the oil prices reveal cracks in our economy. Of course, even though we see cheap oil, we're not seeing the economy responding to this. It's still laying there, not doing anything. But the Saudis are going to keep producing, and that is something that is aimed directly at American production and independence of oil. It also is something that is hurting Russia. And of course, Vladimir Putin is determined to use his alliances to destroy the petrodollar, or essentially our reserve currency. Now, one of the things that you have here in your post-petrodollar chapter here, Marin, is called The Bomb in Your Basement. We talked at the beginning of the hour, we talked about how Putin rose to power with false flags, bombs being placed in apartment buildings and taking out the entire apartment buildings. But this is a bomb that is in the basement of everybody here. You mentioned some things that people can do individually to prepare, but the derivatives that we are now on the hook, just a week or so ago when they came up with this budget from Boehner and the Democrats, putting Americans on the hook to ensure the derivatives that the banks have set up. Talk about the scope of that and what can happen as that blows up.
It is so risky. I'm shocked that the media hasn't talked more about this. This individual piece of legislation is essentially the world's strongest economic weapon of mass destruction that has been created ever.
Yes.
The risks across the board to your pension funds, to the government from the state to federal level, this truly is a shocking element. And yet, who does the government put the blame on? On the working class citizen who's going to have to write unlimited checks. Who's regulating these derivative markets? People don't even understand. I used to teach calculus in a university. These derivative markets are so complex that my colleagues who are PhDs in calculus don't understand this stuff. It's a bunch of maverick bankers who have the Washington in their back pocket, and they basically have carte blanche here. This is a huge risk.
It's very annoying because they're not producing anything. They're basically shutting down in a war on people who actually produce manufactured goods, people who produce energy. Those are the bad guys. And yet the guys who come up with these artificial constructs, as you said, these complex derivatives that are not tied to anything, they're not producing anything that anyone can use. It's merely a scam from these large banks. They're the ones who are now going to get protection. And we saw at the same time that they moved the derivatives to get FDIC protection, they also started making some moves to say that they can come after pensions and the commitments that have been made by private corporations to their employees for a long period of time. The handwriting is on the wall. They're coming after the entire enchilada. They're coming after the wealth of individual Americans as well as our energy independence, aren't they?
Well, Obama's not just at war with the savers and workers of America. He's doing more for the foreigners like Putin. Putin couldn't have a better ally running America, and they're at war together. So Obama's doing everything wrong for the average working class, hardworking American. And this is going to come back. And it's ironic that, Obama's all about, the average American. Well, he's going to need more than hope for this. This is going to be a true disaster.
Wow. Thank you so much for joining us. It is an excellent book. It is a real page turner. Guys, you can get a clip of all the different tabs that I put in here. I wish I had time to cover everything that we have. You can see all those different tabs. I wish I had time to cover all the information that's in here. Get this book, read it. It will really enhance your understanding of the background behind this. Thank you so much. Marin Katusa, The Colder War, available from KC Research. We'll be right back and we'll take your calls.
In the past decade, we have witnessed unparalleled scientific discoveries in the area of health. But no one has put together a formula that focuses directly on brain health, nerve growth factors, and optimizing your cellular energy at the same time. DNA Force is one of the most expensive formulas to produce. Some of the ingredients in DNA Force are $12,000 a kilogram. We are using the coveted, patented, only American source of PQQ, CoQ10, and more. You want the best that's out there at the lowest price anywhere? Well, we're bringing you a total win-win. The ultimate value, cutting-edge, trailblazing game changer that also supports the InfoWar. We have produced a limited run of DNA Force, and it will take up to 12 weeks to produce more once we sell out. Secure your DNA Force today at InfoWarsLife.com or call toll-free 888-253-3139. DNA Force from InfoWars Life.